Hi, how are you? Good to see you again.
It's been a long time. I
Yeah,
was thinking about when I last saw you, but it must be more like a decade.
Wow,
a decade.
that
Don't say
sounds
that.
long.
Don't
Then
say
you
that.
suddenly sounded
That makes me feel like a lot older than I
old.
really
Yeah.
No. You were just a child at that time.
All right, I think we actually have to start because it's 2 minutes past. So we are, you. I think I'm unmuted.
I think I'm not unmuted, so let me
Unmute yourself. Hello. Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Yes, I'm getting the thumbs up there. So, all right. So, disclaimer or word of warning first. This event is going to be streamed or is being streamed. So, anything you say out loud, at least, will be picked up by the world. So, mind your words in a good way. All right. So. Welcome everyone. It's great to see you here this morning for this seminar, which we've called "How to Clean an Election." And I'm super grateful to have with me Professor Nic Cheeseman from the University of Birmingham in the UK. He is I don't know how many of you are actually out there, but he is a professor of democracy. Among other things, and international development, etc. And so I think that's one of the qualifying criteria for having him here. The other one is, of course, that he's written. I'm not sure if I can call it a bestseller yet, could I? But a very, very fascinating book called "How to Steal an Election" with Brian Klaas, which was published last year. Which is a very, in my opinion, at least, a very nice introduction to the topics that we're going to do here. For an academic book, it's quite an easy read, so it's recommended to everyone with an interest in the topic. All right, so today the topic will focus on what is almost the final chapter in your book, basically what you can do about elections in order to make them to perform a more democratic function. And of course, in order for you to get to that final chapter, you do kind of have to spell out the problems with elections beforehand. So we'll spend a bit of time going there as well. But I thought before we got into the nitty-gritty that we'd start off with something fun, something empirical. So on the 30th of December last year, as some of you know, there was a new election in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in which 3 contestants run, and neither of them was the incumbent President Kabila. Although there was a pro-Kabila candidate on the ticket, he wasn't considered to be the favorite. And there were 2 opposition candidates contesting as well, and both of them had not really a chance of winning. All the polls indicated that there was one opposition candidate who was likely to win that election. So you had a relatively weak incumbent who couldn't run. You had 2 opposition candidates that were competing, and you had an uncertain outcome. So the results weren't being announced by the Electoral Commission of the DRC. They were kind of pulling their legs a bit in terms of announcing the results. But finally then on the 10th of January, the results were announced. And lo and behold, the opposition candidate who no one really thought would win was announced the winner. And this created an uproar among both international experts and among local observer groups who had observed the election and was highly confident that it was not possible for this candidate to win. At the same time, he was an opposition candidate, and so the question of rigging wasn't really straightforward. I mean, it's not something that you usually think about, that it's possible for an opposition candidate to rig a national election. So, Nic, was this the first time that you saw an opposition-rigged election victory in a country?
It's a great question. I think I'd put it slightly differently. I don't think the opposition candidate was in a position to rig the election. So I would frame it slightly differently. I would say this was the first time we've seen an incumbent rig an election for an opposition candidate. And I think if you look at sort of Kabila's options coming into the process, sort of 4 or 5 years out, he had sort of option A, option B, option C, right? So option A was basically somehow get another term or be able to extend his term. So he'd had this long process where he deliberately delayed the election on the basis that if no one was elected to succeed him, he could stay in office, right? Kind of extending the term by default, not actually claiming a proper third term, just never ending his current term. And DRC politics developed loads of fantastic words to explain, like glissement, which means to extend until essentially it becomes a fait accompli. So they had entire vocabulary developed around this. But Kabila was actually too weak to follow that through and basically never hold the election. The strength of opposition, strength of civil society, strength of international community was too strong. So option B was then select his favored candidate. He was going to rig in basically his favored candidate. Only his favored candidate was so weak that even with all of the advantages of incumbency, they couldn't get him over the line. So then you're sitting there facing what looks like an opposition victory from a candidate who's actually relatively robust and significantly is opposed to you. And then that's where the stroke of genius comes in, right? Plan C, hang on a minute, but we can pick the opposition candidate we want. So we pick the opposition candidate who's really weak because we know that he's pliant. We know, given his limited popular base, that he can't really resist the plan we're going to put to him. And we form an alliance with him in which he takes the presidency, he signs a deal that basically allows us to keep power behind the closed doors, and the international community will have to accept this. Why? Because we're giving them a transfer of power, which is the ultimate litmus test of democracy. So the international community get what they want, the ruling party gets what they want, there's a sleight of hand in the middle and the wrong opposition candidate wins, and then you have this really interesting question, which is how is everyone going to respond? So you initially see this response, which is, that's not acceptable, right? Even the African Union managed to come up with something. Lots of regional leaders were a bit confused. The international community are a bit confused. The domestic observers make it very clear privately that they have different figures. But very quickly, everybody realizes that no one else is going to move first, right? And because nobody moves first, everybody keeps quiet. So all of us have now, in a way, apart from people like us who sit here talking about it on the live stream. But apart from that, there's kind of been now an acceptance of a process that was very clearly problematic. And I think there's two lessons to take from this. One is, leaders that are able to give the international community what they want, even if it's through a very poor quality process, are able to escape being held to high democratic standards. And the very clever thing here was to give the international community a transfer of power, which made it very hard for them to come out in a strong way against this. But the second is the way in which leaders generate confusion around elections, and confusion then becomes a reason in and of itself for inaction. And I think one of the things that's true of many elections recently is that it's not that we've been able to show they've been rigged, we simply lack the data to be able to show one way or the other because the process becomes so convoluted. So in this case, for example, the domestic observers couldn't legally release their findings until the Electoral Commission had released its findings. That's in the electoral law of a lot of countries. So we knew what the domestic observers had found, but they couldn't give us the exact figures. And without the exact figures in the report, it was very difficult for people in the media to really push the point because it was kind of, well, we know this, but we haven't been told officially. So there's something here about the way that you can create confusion to stop people actually finding out what happened in elections. And I think if you think about what happened in Kenya in 2017, in other elections we've seen over the last few years, a lot of the time what we're seeing is a high level of confusion, and the leaders of the country then say, well, the confusion means that we should be allowed to continue to govern. And the opposition feels that the confusion means that there was rigging, but it's very difficult to prove it.
All right. So I'm going to backtrack a bit now, because the interesting thing about what you're saying now and listening to you talking, I think that it's important to highlight the fact what you're saying, that the DRC election in many ways passed the litmus test of what we consider to be a democratic election. It was a turnover of power. An opposition candidate won. But at the same time, it clearly wasn't democratic if you get into the nitty-gritty of how it was carried out and the quality of the election. So backtracking a bit, how did we get to the situation we are in today, where almost all countries in the world are holding at least nominally competitive multi-party elections, meaning that opposition candidates are allowed to run and contest. But at the same time, we are seeing democratic backsliding, that the number of democracies in the world is, if not dropping, then at least not expanding either. And more countries are holding elections under conditions that can't be considered to be free and fair. So how did we get here?
Well, I think we've seen two big trends, right? So as you say, one is the increase in elections, and that happens in multiple waves. Latin America, then we get Africa and post-communist Europe. And by the time most of those continents are holding elections, we're talking about a globe in which the vast majority of countries are holding multi-party elections. But really what that does is not usher in a new wave of democracy so much as usher in a new form of authoritarianism. And if we'd have been sitting here talking to you guys 20 years ago, the average authoritarian state would have been a one-party state, it would have been a military regime, it might have been a personal dictatorship. You know, today the average one-party state holds elections. It just holds elections in a very different way. And I think one thing that obviously political science literature has been quite quick to pick up through languages like competitive authoritarianism, Levitskian way, or electoral authoritarianism, etc., is that nature of combination of authoritarian context but holding elections. But perhaps the wider world, in terms of how people have conceptualized the progress, hasn't always recognized that. And so the holding elections has often been seen as something that indicates a broader set of democratic practices that in reality aren't there. And I think what we've seen in the last 4 to 5 years is a further deterioration in the broader context in those countries. So most of the countries we're talking about are not countries that had reached a democratic, peak and are now falling back. I think we'd probably say most of them actually had never achieved democracy. So these were really countries that were already competitive authoritarian. They already were holding elections in challenging contexts. But I think what we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years is we've seen a significant deterioration from that. So, for example, one of the things we've seen is attacks on NGOs. One of the things we've seen is reductions in media freedom. Another thing we've seen is sort of increasing legislation around censorship. All of this is not directly about elections, but what it's doing is it's reducing the amount of information and the freedom available to citizens who are participating in elections. And so the context within which elections are being held is getting more and more and more difficult. And that's basically, in some ways, it's more a process of authoritarian entrenchment than it is democratic backsliding, because, as I say, these were not necessarily countries that had already reached a high quality of democracy. But what it does mean is that the quality of those elections and the ability of the opposition to win is getting harder and harder. But the key thing, I think, in terms of thinking about how we clean up elections, is that the things that I've just mentioned are not things that will usually mean an election will be disqualified or condemned by the international community. Things like level of media freedom, access to information, censorship, quality of freedom of NGOs and civil society will be in an international observation report, but they will not be used as reasons to condemn an election. And so essentially what you do if you're a clever authoritarian is you change the context, you change the playing field, you hollow out democracy from the inside, and you do it in those slightly lower profile ways that have a long-term effect, but are unlikely to actually be condemned by the international community around an election.
So what you're saying is really interesting. So my understanding would be that we tend to think about, and now I'm not talking about the general academic literature, but kind of the public profile of how elections take place in this kind of contest. So when we tend to think that there's been unfoul play, we think about ballot stuffing, we think about electoral rigging, we think about opposition supporters being beaten up in the streets. So what you're saying now is that we're not seeing that, but we are seeing kind of a more slow-moving, gradual process where you change the institutional and contextual climate which elections take place on. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we still see some of that. If you think about what's happening in Sudan recently, etc., we still see brutal putting down of protests. But, one of the things we did in the book was we asked authoritarians and we asked the people who work for them to rig elections. There was a big industry in this, and many of them are from North America and Europe, right? Many of the people who go around helping people to think about how to give themselves an unfair advantage are international. So in a sense, this is really an international problem. And if you ask them, they will tell you, right? If you have to use ballot box stuffing to win an election, you failed. You're a bad dictator, right? If you have to snatch it on the day with violence in the streets, you failed. Because these are the things that trigger an international, condemnation. These are the things that embarrass you. They get opposition to the streets. They make it clear you haven't got legitimacy. And if you're holding elections to gain legitimacy, right? If you're an authoritarian who is holding an election to gain legitimacy and therefore access to the international community, potentially financial, investment from America, the UK, Europe in general, then you want to maintain that legitimacy throughout the polls. So you want to win without anyone being able to show that you were being a nefarious dictator. So things like ballot box stuffing right at the end of the election are likely to generate a public outcry, as those beating people in the streets. If you could manage the election without doing that, it's much better. So they talk about this kind of sweet spot. And the sweet spot is the strategies that are really effective but are very invisible. So a classic sweet spot would be gerrymandering, right? You fix the legislative boundaries to give yourself an inbuilt majority in parliament, even if you don't win that many votes. And it's great because it gives you a secure majority whilst being really low profile, right? There have been very few riots in history about gerrymandering, someone moving a boundary one way or another to make sure that the ruling party wins its seat at the next election. Because it happens well in advance of the election. It's a kind of technical decision. So this is the kind of, genius of long-term election manipulation. So what you really want to do is use those kind of strategies. So for example, making sure that you don't register people. We've gone to countries where it seems like we have quite good evidence that birth certificates are not being given out in opposition areas. Because if you don't get a birth certificate, you can't get a voter's card. If you can't get a voter's card, you can't vote, right? So 18 years out, basically taking away people's right to documentation to undermine their political rights so they don't register. So without any rigging on the day, you just know that the voters register is going to break in favor of your people because your people are more likely to be there because you've denied documentation to others. So there's all sorts of strategies like this that you can use to give yourself such an inbuilt advantage that when you go into the election, you actually have very little to fear. The other thing that you can do, right, is exclude rival candidates. And one of the things we've seen is the international community accept a number of elections recently where potential candidates were disqualified. And this is interesting in the DRC, right? I mean, even before we talk about whether or not the right opposition candidate won, there were two opposition candidates that many people feel should have been on that ballot paper that were not there because they were basically excluded by the regime. Now, we don't really talk about that much as being a major factor in election manipulation. And yet, actually, the number one thing you can do to boost your majority if you're an incumbent president is to exclude your nearest rival. And yet, lots of the time, we've seen people manipulate either the rule of law or legislation around ethnic or religious parties to ban their closest rival from standing. And then, of course, they preside over a good election because they don't face a strong opponent. So they win with 60%. The international observers often turn up and say, well, it looked pretty good on the day. The problem is the election was manipulated months out. Now, if you read the reports of the observers, all of this will be in the reports. So they do a very good job of documenting this and making recommendations and bringing this to people's attention. But what doesn't always happen is that set of recommendations translating into a really condemnatory public statement. Often the public statement itself will pull its punches while the report will be really good. And obviously the report comes out after the election. Not necessarily that many people read the report, whereas the public statement is what goes into the media. So I think one of the questions here is, can we encourage election observers to change the emphasis and to actually focus more on these background contextual factors? And maybe to be more willing to say, as some did ahead of the Zimbabwean election, the background contextual factors are so worrying that we worry we can't hold a free and fair election in this context, and actually get that out ahead of the election so that you're actually sort of, as it were, using that as a lever to encourage the ruling party to pull back on some of these things, rather than saying it after the election when perhaps the time has gone.
So what you're saying is that there is almost like a hierarchy of electoral manipulation options, and all the way at the top you have these kind of measures that in many aspects you would also find in democratic countries, right? That's one of the typical questions or answers that I get to my questions when I do interviews with politicians and bureaucrats in authoritarian regimes. They say, but this is the same thing that you're doing in the US, for example. They often refer to the US. So gerrymandering, changing districts, isn't in and by itself that it can't be said to be undemocratic. It can, but I mean, we do it in democracies as well. So why shouldn't they be able to do it since we're doing it as well, in a sense?
Well, I think there's two sides of this, right? So one is we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
rather than pulling everyone down to our level, we should look to be better. But I do think there's a really important point there, which is that if we want to go around the world talking about good elections, we need to be much more humble about the limitations of our own democracies. And I think one of the things that will increasingly happen over the next 10 years in the era of Trump and the dubious Brexit vote and everything else will be people throwing back in our faces, look at the quality of your own democracy before you come lecturing us. So I think the first thing that we actually need to do, and we call for this in the book, is an investigation of the limitations of our own democracy. So just two good examples of that. The only country I know of in the world where every single major party has been found guilty and fined for exceeding voter election spending laws is the United Kingdom. Every single major party has been not only caught and found guilty, but fined, to the extent that the head of the Electoral Commission recently said that the fines were so low that basically parties were factoring the fines into their election budgets because it was worth paying the fine to be able to break the laws. I think that just shows us, right, that politicians go for these strategies whenever they can get away with it, right? The prize is so great that you're going to break the campaign spending laws unless the fine is so great that you basically can't afford not to. So that's one, thing, and it gives us a good example of the fact that there's nothing African or Latin American or Asian about this. This is a universal phenomenon where we have weak institutions and weak punishments. The second, though, which is in some ways even sadder, is what we've seen in the United States. So, one of the things that's been really worrying our colleagues in America is a wave of strategies that seem designed to suppress voters. And, immediately after Barack Obama came to power, we saw an increased focus effectively on regulations that would make it harder for people to vote. Now, this is a good thing, right, in a sense, because people like me should be saying, yes, let's have really tough restrictions. Let's make someone show 15 pieces of identification to be able to vote, because that rules out multiple voting, it rules out fake voting, it rules out children voting, right? All the stuff that we worry about, let's make sure they have to show a passport and an ID and a finger scan and everything. And of course, if you look at how things are going, for example, in Africa, we see an increasing use of digital technology to do exactly this, right? Fingerprints to register to vote, fingerprints to actually be verified in the polling station, in some cases, even electronic voting itself. But we know that this is often used selectively to stop certain people from voting. Right? So we know, for example, in the United States, certain communities are less likely to have the identification that you need. So, for example, new immigrants are less likely to have it. Homeless people are less likely to have it. People who've had a history of mental illness are less likely to have it. And many of these groups tend to break Democrat rather than Republican, right, historically. So one of the big concerns is that one of the reasons why we see these legislations coming in is not because people want to actually secure the election, because actually we have almost no evidence that this is a systematic way in which elections are being rigged in America. So it's a solution that doesn't really have a problem to solve. But what it is doing is it's significantly ensuring that minority communities who vote a certain way are not going to go to the polls. So this is where, you have to then sort of look at the balance, right, of probabilities. What are the chances that an election is going to be rigged this way? What are the costs that tightening and cleaning an election in this manner is going to do? And I think it seems fairly clear to us that what this is about is stopping a certain set of voters from going to the polls. So again, the fact that that is happening in contemporary America today is a great example of the way in which politicians try and game the system to give themselves an advantage. And in a sense, the genius is, right, it's exactly the same strategy as the DRC. Yeah. Right? The American politicians are giving us something that is said to be democratic, like the DRC gave us a transfer of power. They're giving us a stronger electoral system which has higher requirements and therefore is more impervious to rigging. But what both of them are doing through that mechanism is through the back door giving themselves an advantage and making it easier to win elections. And we need to call that out, right? We need to call out that double standard and to point out that that's happening in the United States and the UK. And on the basis of that, then go to other countries and say, we're working on our problem, can you come and help us with this? And we'll come and help you with, for example, media context, censorship, etc., in your own place.
I will definitely come back to the issue of technology, because that's a big, or kind of posited as a big part of the solution to many of the problems that elections are facing. But before we get there, you also touched on the issues, which is kind of going down the hierarchy of your book. You start out with the gerrymandering, and then you kind of move down to the next level, which I think you call vote buying, or at least financing politics. And this is also something that we see as a big emerging problem, not just in autocracies, but also in democracies. Just that as inequality is rising in particularly, but also just in general, the importance of money in politics is increasing. And this is also something that it's really difficult to find, or seems to be difficult to find a solution that works to handle. So what would be your take on that kind of this monetization of politics? Who gains from it, and what can be done to fight it?
Well, one of the problems about the monetization of politics is, of course, it turns political systems into kind of plutocracies, right,
Yeah.
where only the rich can really compete. That's clearly been the case in the United States for a long time. It's clearly the case in many sub-Saharan African elections, where it's pretty rare for a candidate who doesn't have strong business and finance connections to win. So I think it is a major concern. In some ways, though, I'm less concerned about money in politics than the other things we've talked about.
Okay.
For two reasons. One, we know that money doesn't always buy votes, right? You know, the exchange of money for a vote is often not really what's going on. So when you see someone pushing a little bit of money into someone's hand, and then you talk to that person later on, what they'll tell you is they took the same money from 3 or 4 candidates, and now they're going to decide who to vote for based on their conscience. Now, you know, that's not always the case. But where you have a genuinely secret ballot and voters do not feel that they're being repressed, you will, I think, see voters often vote the other way. So a classic example is the Zambian election of 2011,
Yeah, sure.
where we know that the ruling party outspent the opposition by about 5 to 1. We know that they did a vast vote-buying campaign, which pushed money into people's hands. But the opposition told them, people, the voters, basically take the money, vote for us, right? It's a secret ballot, eat all the food you can, drink all the beer you can, take all the money you can, vote for us in the polling station. And they did. And the opposition won the election. So I think the simple handing out of money isn't necessarily as effective as sometimes people think it is. I think what's really important, though, is that those other components are there. So, for example, that it's genuinely a secret ballot, that
Yep.
people don't feel repressed. For example, in Zimbabwe, there was a lot of discussion of how sort of the giving out of food aid was connected to the collecting of people's personal details and then a commitment to vote in the election. Now, that's a much more pernicious system because people feel locked into a political process in which they're giving their details and their vote in exchange for a long-term set of support. And because they're embedded within a system and their details are being taken, they may well feel that they don't actually have the right to vote another way. And there's also a lot of research coming out now that ruling parties are getting clever at persuading people that their vote is not secret. Right? So a classic one is that if you buy someone's vote, they will go into the polling station and claim to be illiterate. If you're illiterate, you get help by the polling station officials, and then you are asked to vocalize who you would like to support. So you say very loudly, I would like to vote for President X. The person then records the vote, and the people outside who are paying you to vote that way can hear that you voted that way. So it's a way of enforcing the contract, right? Because the problem with vote buying is you can't enforce the contract if you don't know how the person actually voted. So I think one of the things that's really worrying is that in an increasing number of elections, we see significant percentages of people in surveys saying they're not sure their vote is secret. And that means that if they had money forced on them by the ruling party, they might be much more reluctant now than they would have been before to vote for whoever they wanted to. But the money, in a way, is less significant to me than that arrangement around it that makes people feel they can't vote how they want to when they get in. I think the other thing that's true is that handing out small amounts of money around elections is probably less significant than the warped distribution of development in the lead up.
Yep.
Right? And if you actually look at most surveys, at what voters want and what voters think is acceptable and legitimate around an election, most voters actually have very little problem with the targeted distribution of development in return for political support, whereas they have much more of a kind of moral issue with vote buying. So I think the really successful politicians are using their money to build these links over 4 or 5 years
Yep.
in terms of the distribution of development, and then topping that up with money at election time, which is kind of a little bit of an added signal about the credibility of the candidate and their ability to access wealth. But it's not the handing out of the money that's winning the election.
So what you're saying here is that basically when you look at each of these strategies individually and vote buying, for example, in particular, it doesn't really, it needs to be considered the overall effect of all the measures taken together. So you need to kind of say that this is based on this and this, and it kind of reminds me of the saying by Pablo Escobar that plata or plomo, money or lead. So it's not just about the money, but the threat of lead needs also to be there in a sense.
And what you see in the end, if someone employs all of these strategies, is a kind of interlocking web.
Yeah.
You know, the voters will feel that they're being censored and that their people might be looking at their phones or looking at their Facebook or their Twitter messages. You see people out on street corners who are reminding voters to vote a certain way because otherwise there might be trouble, right? So a sort of implicit threat of violence. Then you see, you know, people deliberately being denied things like food aid because they didn't vote the right way last time round. And then all of a sudden, in that context, being told to vote a certain way and given money by the ruling party becomes something that seems like an imperative rather than an option and a choice. So as you say, it's a really good way of putting it. It's the interlocking web of all of those factors that puts voters in that situation. And I think it's worth saying, just to disaggregate a bit, this is often particularly the case in rural areas rather than urban areas, right? Urban areas, people often have a bit more information. They're more likely to be able to get access to the internet. They're more likely to be in close proximity to civil society organizations. The international community will be based there during an election. There's often a different context there than in a rural area that might be much more under the control of a traditional leader, a long way from the capital city, much weaker information, and where people may feel much more vulnerable to the ruling party.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years, particularly now in sub-Saharan Africa, is that governments have become increasingly reliant on a rural support base to keep power, having lost the urban support base. So if you look at most of the countries we would talk about, the urban areas vote for the opposition in much heavier numbers than do the rural areas. And I think that's a really interesting thing. In 20 years' time, say Africa is going to go from being a predominantly rural to a predominantly urban country as a result of demographic changes, the ruling parties are going to struggle, because their strategy of retaining control through rural votes is going to come under threat when the majority of voters are urban for the first time. And I think if you look at the way someone like Museveni is dealing with someone like Bobi Wine, the way it was so violent, the way it was so immediate, I think that's partly a response to the recognition of that trend, that actually this is where the future threat comes from.
All right, so having kind of described this interlocking web and all the possibilities that are out there for would-be autocrats and autocrats to manipulate elections, it's not really surprising that you can have autocratizing elections, meaning elections that lead to more autocracy. But at the same time, we do see like certain events where elections are still playing this role of bringing forth democracy, or at least being a harbinger of democracy. So like the case of the Gambia a couple of years ago, where a relatively unknown opposition candidate suddenly came out and absolutely trounced the incumbent president in an election, and the electoral commission announced the results, and it all went well. So there must be some way, and arguably some ways that are more affecting than others, of combating these kinds of this interlocking web. So the first one you already touched about, and that's being much touted by international agencies, both private and public, and that is technology. So by increasing the level of technology in election, it will become more transparent, more easy to observe, and all these kinds of issues. So do you see technology as an important part of the solution to cleaning up elections?
It can be. I mean, we wrote an article on this in Democratization, and it can definitely be one of the components. I think the introduction of technology often increases voter confidence, and that can be a good thing. As we were just talking about, making voters feel secure is important, and giving people confidence that the election is going to be run well because technology is introduced is a good thing. And it's obviously true that I think in many of the cases I've seen, using technology to generate a new electoral roll helps.
Yeah.
Because if you make everybody register fresh and you use the fingerprints or use an iris scan, basically you can't have loads of dead people on the roll anymore, right? So the sort of dead voters, the ghost voters that have plagued elections for many years do tend to drop off. The problem is that leaves lots of new ways to manipulate the elections. And what you do when you use technology is you take a very expensive piece of kit that not that many people understand how it works, and you put it in the hands of the Electoral Commission. And so the effectiveness of the technology, to some extent, is the effectiveness of the Electoral Commission itself. So if you've got an Electoral Commission that is pretty independent from the government, really wants to improve, to do a good job, technology can be transformative because it can genuinely constrain all the parties. But if you've got an Electoral Commission that's very pliant, that's actually under the control of the ruling party and is really there to help the ruling party retain power, then there's no real reason to think they're going to implement the technology in a way that's going to enable them to do that. So just to give you examples, in the last few years, we've seen, for example, in Kenya, 2013, almost every part of the electoral process was revolutionized by the purchase of new technology. So voters were registered using this technology, they were going to be verified through this technology, and the votes were then going to be sent back in by using mobile phone apps that would send in the votes to a live stream online. The idea being that this would give you a check on the manual counting process, so you would stop the process of fixing the vote between the polling station and the official result being declared at the Electoral Commission. And the first part of this went fairly well. So the actual registering of voters went fairly well. We got a much better voters roll. But then everything started to fall apart. On the day of the election itself, we know from the domestic observers that about 50% of these kits that were supposed to be used to verify voters actually broke down or were not employed. So we know that the critical sort of stop on people voting incorrectly, in other words, people who weren't registered voting or people voting multiple times, went down. We also know that as soon as the election results started to come in, the mobile phone transmission system broke down and just started to give us the same result over and over again and had to basically not be used. And not only that, but the mobile phone transmission system artificially inflated the number of votes that were said to be disqualified by 8, which generated an entire scandal around the election about how could so many people have failed to vote properly. There must have been something happening. It was a bug in the system that artificially inflated the vote. No one has explained to us how that vote bug really got there. The explanation officially for why the mobile phone transmission system went down is simply that this was a server error. The server didn't work well enough. We didn't have enough capacity in the system. The explanation for why the verification points went down was, well, we didn't actually have access to electricity in every polling station. This was a trial run. We didn't really have enough time to pilot it. But this goes back to what I was saying when I was talking about the DRC earlier. Is this a genuine cock-up or is this a conspiracy? And there are certain points when it becomes impossible to tell, right? So from the outside, as people who were there, we watched that election incredibly carefully. And you can't tell whether this is a cock-up or conspiracy. It's plausible that a server error brought down the mobile phone transmission system. It's plausible that each of these polling stations simply couldn't quite get the technology to work on the day despite really trying to. But it's also plausible that the Electoral Commission deliberately didn't try very hard, so that there were enough gaps in the system that the ruling party could use to manipulate the process should it want to. And this is where it comes back to the point, right? So the technology did not safeguard that election. It didn't make that election foolproof. What it did was create a context in which a lot of people placed a lot of faith in the technology, and then ultimately it failed, generating more questions than it answered. And this is where I think the kicker is. This is the really important point. That technology is so expensive that if you use it, you're not doing a lot of other stuff. So to get that technology to work, you're spending something like 50 million euros. And that's 50 million euros, the international community, because it's usually the international community that pays for a lot of it. That's 50 million euros the international community is not spending on civil society, domestic monitoring, supporting political party agents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of our concerns is, if you like, the opportunity cost. If you invest all of your money in technology and the technology doesn't work, you've probably not invested in all this other stuff. And when the technology goes down, there's nobody there to give the safeguard because you were relying on the technology for that. Now, Kenya's a good example. Kenya then, ahead of the 2017 elections, decides, well, what happened was we didn't get the technology quite right, so we're going to do it again. Another 50 million euros, a complete new kit. And the new kit largely worked, so it worked much better than before. The verification in polling stations was much more effective. Many fewer machines broke down. But still, at the final bit of the process, when it came to the critical thing about how are we going to get the results, the machines were supposed to not only verify voters, but also take the scans of the forms at the polling station. Those forms were supposed to be then sent in digital fashion so that we could look online at the system and see the scan for every single polling station in the country. Now, that actually would have been a minor miracle, right? That would have been an incredible election, to be able to go online and see the polling station level results and scan for every one of the 40,000 polling stations would be incredible transparency. Problem was, a certain subset of these forms never came through. That set of forms not coming through generated opposition concerns that those were the areas in which the election was being manipulated. The Electoral Commission did not provide a good explanation of why those forms hadn't come in. Fast forward, we go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says for various different reasons this election was unconstitutional because it didn't follow due process, and they disqualified the election. So we've now had 2 elections in a row in Kenya where we've even seen a significant improvement in the quality of the technology, but that hasn't generated, at least in the eyes of the opposition, an election that was more credible and hasn't generated an election that was less controversial. So the key point is technology can make a big difference, but it's got to be technology in a context of reasonable political trust with an electoral commission that's committed to making that technology work. And that means technology is most likely to work where you don't really need it, right? Because if technology is going to work best where you've already got trust in an electoral commission that's going to do a reasonable job, you probably could have achieved a similar result using other strategies with that electoral commission. So our concern is, when you hear a government like the DRC's telling you it's going to introduce election technology, or like the Angolan government, or, and they want the international community to help support it, that's when you start thinking, hang on a minute, is this actually going to be technology that's really going to benefit or not? So, one of the best cases for technology in Africa is Ghana, where over successive elections with minor controversies, the use of technology has been fine-tuned, and there were no controversies in 2016, and it helped to safeguard an opposition victory. But again, Ghana is probably a more favorable environment anyway. So if we're now talking about the next set of countries coming up to hold elections and whether or not it's worth investing in technology, our argument would not be that you should always say no, but that you should really think very carefully about whether that's worth the cost of not spending that 50 million elsewhere on civil society and domestic observation.
So what you're saying is basically that you kind of need to adopt a multi-track approach where you do several things conjointly. And I'm going to open up for questions really soon, but I just want to kind of challenge you a bit on the components of that multi-track approach. So two things. First of all, what is it legitimate and proper for the international community to do in terms of the principle of not interfering in domestic politics? So, for example, major questions that others in this room have worked more on than me, but political party support, for example. To what extent can actually the international community go in and help the opposition party, which is mostly what they need, build up proper structures, particularly in the rural areas? Second of all, with regards to domestic actors, what can they legitimately do without being seen as being partisan agents of the opposition? So, for example, a big problem for civil society organizations is, of course, that they are facing legislation that are either labeling them foreign agents or intermediaries of the opposition, and therefore not worthy of state support, etc. So how do you handle this balance of kind of promoting a free and fair election without being seen as taking sides and being partisan?
It's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to know exactly what you should and shouldn't do. And partly, of course, it's different in every country because the position and the relationship with the domestic government is different. I mean, of course, from the very beginning, in principle, you only do observation if you've been invited in by the host government, which means that the host government has signed up to the principle of observation, both international and domestic observation. And so in that sense, you have a prior agreement, however strong, with the government that domestic and international observation is going to be done, which means that in principle, doing that better isn't something that should bring you into conflict with the government.
Sure.
So whereas supporting an NGO that's very clearly associated with the ruling party might be, supporting a civil society coalition that's designed to do domestic observation should be relatively uncontroversial in and of itself, as should investing more money in international observation. So my argument would be twofold. One, the international observers have done an awful lot, and we need to recognize how much they've done over the last 20 years. We've moved to a model where long-term observation is the default. We've moved to a model where using political experts who understand the context in their countries is the default. So observers who miss things do not miss them because they turn up the day before elections or because they don't have country experts in their teams. They miss them because they're deliberately hidden from them in clever ways by incumbents. It's not that we have stupid observers out there. We have brave and clever observers out there in almost all my experience. But it's not always easy for them to report on what is happening. So one of the things we still have, right, is a model where observers will turn up, something like a team of 130. That's 2 pairs if they work in pairs. So that's really 65 pairs. And they'll then be distributed across the country with a strong base in the capital city. And my argument would be, I'm not sure having 65 people out there monitoring 45,000 polling stations is really a good way to detect election fraud anymore. I think that's a kind of model of election observation that we've had for 20, 30 years. And maybe actually what we need to do is say the international community will work on the high level, more technical stuff, overseeing the commission, overseeing the processes and the new technology at the capital city level, and will get its input from civil society, domestic observers who have a much more universal reach. And if you started to actually specialize a little bit like that and conceive of this as being teamwork between the international and domestic observers, you might do two things. You might have a much more effective coverage, and you might also start to build long-term domestic capacity. One of the big complaints that domestic observation groups have is that they don't feel that there's enough investment in building up their long-term capacity so that at some point in the future, international observers are not necessary, right? Because ideally, we don't want to have international observers. It would be much more effective if what we had was brilliant domestic observers with the capacity to monitor their own elections, because that would do two things. One, it would mean it was not the international community coming to lecture people, and therefore you wouldn't be vulnerable to the anti-colonial card, because it would be local observers who would be saying this. But also, two, you have a much greater capacity to actually cover the country. You know, when the international community go, we deploy teams of 130. You know, in a Ghanaian election, the observers will deploy 18 to 20,000. Right? So they've actually got a much greater capacity to give us a real sense of what's going on.
Sure.
But I think that, you know, that would be two of the strategies that we could start to look for. I think the other point is, in terms of what the international community do, is that we need to see more consistency. And one of the things that is quite difficult is to have an international community that wants regime change in Venezuela, but not the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? When in Venezuela, we have a candidate who didn't even win an election being recognized by the international community, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a candidate who did win the election cannot be recognized by the international community, right? Those kinds of inconsistencies undermine the legitimacy of international observation and the international community more generally. And almost every year, we have that inconsistency. And every year, when you go and talk about elections, something like that will be thrown back in your face. And it's very, very difficult, of course, because there are different contexts in every country that shapes the way in which the international community engages. But I think that perception of hypocrisy, inconsistency, and as we talked about before, failing to address the democratic issues back home actually hurts our ability to talk to populations. Because leaders don't just make their decision as to whether or not to hit out at the international community in a vacuum. It's much easier for them to do that when they feel it's going to resonate with their people. And I worry at the minute that we're making it easier and easier and easier for that message to resonate. And if we started to actually deal with things properly, it would become harder. And at that point, you know, the leaders would actually have a much more difficult decision to make about whether or not to scapegoat the international community. At the minute, that decision resonates well because people actually see that hypocrisy in their everyday lives.
Yep. So it starts with honesty and kind of applying a proper level everywhere, in a sense. All right, thank you so much. I think we have 12 minutes for questions. So I'll just open the floor up and remind everyone that this is being streamed. So if you catch the catch box, then be prepared for it to be streamed. All right.
Thanks very much for this very interesting discussion. Just
you need to hold it.
okay. Just first, a recent example of how changing the rules are also applied in established democracies. Last week, I think it was. The legislature of Washington State changed the rules for how to get on the ballot paper for 2020. And it now says that only candidates that have declared their income and tax returns for the last 5 years will be eligible to be on the ballot. So the person who currently resides in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue will not be allowed to run in 2020 in Washington State if this ruling is upheld. But what I wanted to ask you about the technology, and that is, to what extent has social media benefited opposition forces, or is it true that, or sometimes they claim that initially new technology, also like social media, initially that benefits opposition. But after a while, also incumbent regimes become used to this, and therefore that later the effects have changed in the direction of benefiting the incumbent rather than the opposition.
Are you all right with us collecting a couple of questions?
Yeah, that's sure.
So there's two at the front here at least. Yes, we'll start there.
Hi, thank you for an interesting discussion. I sort of have 3 points I want to raise. So building on from the social media, this question goes out to the context of the US. And I saw this documentary, and I think it was in New York, during the electoral campaigns, they actually used, because they have these huge billboards, right, with like the campaigns and everything. And this might actually sound sort of crazy, but behind the screens, they use these cameras and with built-in algorithms that sort of scan the faces and recognition of the people on the street to see how they react to the campaigns. And then if they react badly, they actually change the campaigns. So that's sort of a way to manipulate the voters to feel more satisfied with the candidates. So could you maybe like comment on how algorithms and social media, how does that affect elections? And then I have a question about China, because they have this social capital system, right? And probably, I don't know if when they will have the next election, but how will that affect participation in politics? Because I imagine that only the people with a certain number of points will be able to actually vote. Then I have a question about logistics, and that will be my final one. Because I'm from Sweden, and we had our election in September, and we didn't actually get a government till like half a year later, but actually managed pretty well. But the thing was that some people started making allegations that because all the votes were sent by this company that's called PostNord, and they're a privatized postal company, and actually all of the votes didn't come in because they said that some of the parties had colluded and paid PostNord to actually get rid of some of the sacks with the votes. So maybe it's also a question of logistics and not just technology, and even in the West, where we imagine we have free and open elections. So if you could comment on some of those things. Yeah, thank you.
All right, there was lots of questions there, so I think I'll let Nic answer that, and then we'll do another round afterwards.
Should I throw this?
No, just leave it for now, and then we'll do. I think we have time for another round if you.
So social media. I think I would say less social media. I think WhatsApp has been very important for opposition parties and civil society because it's encrypted. And so for the first time, opposition civil society groups have an encryptive mechanism which they can use to share information. And that's very helpful for political mobilization. So I think that has changed a significant thing. You know, before that, it was very difficult to be sure that you were passing messages that were going to be safe. So that has changed things. But when it comes to social media, I think your sort of final point is absolutely right, that ruling parties ultimately have more resources to make use of these things, and ultimately will, I would say, not just equalize, they will benefit more. Ruling parties now are benefiting more from social media than the opposition. If you look at what happens around the use of fake news and distribution of fake news, we have a new project which is looking at fake news in Nigeria, in the recent Nigerian elections. And it's very clear that, you know, this has been taken over by the parties. The parties have basically set up WhatsApp leaders who basically, you know, all the way down in terms of the way you would have your normal party cells, you now have WhatsApp networks. And these are controlled from centrally in the party and go all the way down, and they are pushing the news out of the party. So essentially what you have is social media now starting to replicate the way that parties would push messages out of other formats, but obviously in a different way. And the ruling party has more money and more capacity to do that usually than opposition parties. So for example, we know that there's 4 or 5 countries in Africa where ruling parties employ between 500 and 1,000 people to be social media influencers. And they go on social media where they call in phone-in shows, or they go on Twitter and they pretend to be normal people, but they basically are there to push the pro-ruling party message. This is in addition to bots and everything else, right? So I think it can be an important tool for the opposition, but we should always realize that the ruling party is going to be pretty quick to get on top of this and subvert it and use it for their own ends. And I think most of the cases that I've seen, I'm pretty sure that it's now almost conferring an advantage on the ruling party rather than on the opposition. So what were the points we had down here? I'm not going to comment on Swedish elections. I know nothing about them. China does have elections at the village level, and as far as I know, everyone's allowed to vote, so they're not using that system, but they could use it in future, as you say. We should also remember that it's not that long ago that the United States had restrictions on voting on the basis of wealth and intelligence, and the UK had restrictions of voting on the basis of wealth and intelligence. So, like many of the ideas of how you manipulate elections, this comes from the bastions of democracy, right? If the UK, we used to have a model where, you would think, oh, if you go to Oxford and Cambridge, you should have 2 votes, other people should have 1 vote, and those people over there should have no votes. And in the US, one of the things we talk about in the book is the way that voter education tests were used to basically disqualify vast numbers of people up until the 1970s. They recently gave one of the tests that were used to see whether someone was intelligent enough to vote in a US election to a class at Harvard, and none of the students passed it. Because, of course, the test was designed to fail people. The test was designed to be impossible. It includes kind of gotcha questions, which are like where you think you've got the answer right, but you haven't, because the question had a comma in a certain place and was designed to, they're those kind of questions. So yeah, these are strategies that all parties have used all countries have used over the time. It is worrying in China. I think the thing that worries me in China going forwards is less that, it's more this pervasive strength of the state. So we had a class recently when I was teaching my students who were talking about Chinese democracy, and I was talking to them about the fact that we have village elections in China, and there's a sense of some degree of deliberative democracy within the party itself. A lot of people don't know that a lot of the local authorities in China actually produce consultative opinion polls that they use to design public policy. And so there's this big focus on collecting the information of the public, even though it's not a democratic system. But the thing, and people were then speculating about, will this generate the idea that consultation should be there and strengthen democratic norms and long-term lead to democratic transition? And then we had that discussion of, is China actually looking like, one of those countries in the Arab Spring before the Arab Spring? But the difference between China and the Arab Spring states is the strength of the state, right? And when you look at what China does in terms of how it controls media, if you look at how it trains journalists to produce certain messages, if you look at the sophistication of its security and its censorship and the strength of its capacity, in all of these ways, it's terrifically strong and much more impressive than any of the Arab Spring states. So I think there are 2 things happening there at the same time. One is an increasing and significant sort of attachment to certain ideas around being able to select your leader, at least at the village level. But the other is the increasing sophistication of the state in terms of its capacity to censor and monitor the population. And those 2 things may well balance out so that we don't actually get that kind of Arab Spring moment. What was the first question?
It was the facial recognition.
Facial recognition, that's a good one. Yeah, I think, nothing about that is rigging an election, right? That's just what advertisers have done all the way through the history of elections. So 60 years ago, that would have been a focus group, right? They would have got 10 voters in a room, they would have showed them 10 different posters, and the one that got them most happy would have been the poster they used in the campaign. Today, they're putting a camera behind a poster so they can see people's responses as they go past, and they're using that to pick the one, right? There's no qualitative difference between those 2 things. So it's creepy, but that's not election manipulation, right? I think one of the things we do need to be clear on is, what do we think is rigging and what isn't? So being really clever at honing your message, getting a message that really responds and connects to people, finding out what people want, that's kind of what they're supposed to be doing, right? That's not rigging. I think where it becomes rigging is if the data you use to do that is stolen. If you steal the data of people personally, that's rigging, because that's illegal and it's illegitimate. And if you then use that to push messages that are clearly beyond the realms of what you're allowed to do in an election. But let me give you an example. The Saatchi and Saatchi campaigns, the very famous advertising campaigns in the UK for the Conservative Party against the Labour Party. They were very cleverly focused group. They found the messages that demonized the Labour Party the most effectively, that made people frightened that the Labour Party would destroy the economy. These included, posters about Labour isn't working, with a long queue of people in an unemployment queue. The famous poster more recently of Tony Blair and the red eyes. Is that illegitimate? Probably not, right? We don't like it. It's kind of scare politics, but it is part and parcel of what political competition has always been. So I do think we sometimes need to kind of do a dividing line between what we don't like and think is unpalatable and what actually should be against the rules and we want to legislate against. But the problem is that that dividing line is becoming increasingly blurred. And I think if you look at the activities of organizations like Cambridge Analytica, what used to be a line that most of us thought we could trace, even if it was fairly close, is now a line that we're becoming increasingly uncomfortable about. And Cambridge, of course, precisely because a lot of the question marks are about whether or not they should have access to that kind of personal data. But even there, I think we have to be a little bit careful about what we assume they can do. I mean, I don't think Cambridge Analytica can do what they claim they can do. I don't think they can design algorithms to sell us voters in a way that makes us want to support those voters. I think if they could do that, they would have sold it to Coca-Cola 20 years ago and they would have made much more money, right? Advertisers have been trying to persuade us to buy their products for a very long time, and they've developed incredibly sophisticated mechanisms for doing so. And even they can't make us buy a Coca-Cola every time instead of a Pepsi. So I'm not sure that Cambridge Analytica have been able to design an algorithm that is quite so clever and quite so effective that it always has the effect that they want. I think one of the things we have to realize is that when you see Cambridge Analytica being interviewed, undercover, this is a guy selling a product, right? So if you come and you're the fake journalist or the fake buyer and you're the journalist, of course I'm selling you a product. Of course I'm going to tell you that I won this election for you or that election for you. What Cambridge don't tell you is that they worked on the 2015 Nigerian election, which they lost, right? They don't tell you that actually their role in the Kenyan election 2017 was pretty peripheral. And actually most of the campaign messages were designed by the campaign team of the president himself. So I think a lot of the time what they're doing is overclaiming in order to basically get more business. And we need to be a little bit more circumspect about what they did. For example, in the Kenyan elections, as far as we can tell, for all of the talk of big data and profiling, what they basically did was help to generate some fairly nasty messages that were designed to demonize the opposition and publish them and send them to everybody.
Yep.
We can't see any, one of the things we did in the lead up to that was actually design loads of profiles of different people on Facebook that look like different kinds of supporters to see if we got different messages in our feeds from the different political parties. And we didn't see any variation whatsoever. It just seemed like it was a glossy, nasty, divisive message that was pushed out to everybody. So I think one thing we need to be a little bit careful of is sometimes swallowing the PR of organizations like Cambridge. And we need to be a bit better at asking, how much is this really different to what would have happened in the previous election campaign? Is it just a slightly slicker version, or is it genuinely something that is transformative? But for example, we don't have a single piece of evidence so far that was independently conducted that Cambridge's algorithm and targeting actually makes any difference to how people vote.
All right, on that note of skepticism, I think we'll have to end today. It's already a few minutes past. This was a Breakfast for Democracy series seminar. This seminar series is organized by the research project Breaking Bad, Understanding the Backlash Against Democracy in Africa, which is funded by the Research Council of Norway. And it's held in collaboration with Bergen Global, which is the lovely scene that we're currently on, and the Christian Michelsen Institute. And thank you so much for coming here, Nic. It was lovely talking to you, and thank you so much to all of you for coming here and listening.